Hello everyone, it's been a while since I've posted any Lord of the Rings builds, so it was definitely time, which is why I made this Uruk-Hai Captain helmet. Primarily when building and painting this one, I was referencing this miniature replica from Weta Workshop. Through the two towers, we get glimpses of helmets with crests, but I can't quite make out a lot of the detail, which is why I went with the miniature. And for another thing, this is an official release from the shop working on the film versions, so I felt safe relying on their images. So let's head to the shop and get started. Okay, two pieces of part A are cut out, and firstly I'm going to close up the seams around the eyes. I'm using contact cement, and I'm applying a decently thick, even layer to the surfaces. And if you want to speed up the build process, if you use a heat gun to dry out the glue to the point where it has just lost its wet shine, you can press the edges together and get a strong bond. If the glue is wet, it won't hold, and if it's too dry, it might stick, but it'll easily pull apart. So it's about finding that sweet spot, and that is just at the point where the glue doesn't look wet anymore. And while I attach the seams, I always focus on the outside visible side, trying to make sure the edges line up as well as possible. And while you're at it, go ahead and close the seams up on the second piece of part A. Then the two part A's can be attached to each other. The registration lines are key here because they are what gives the helmet the correct curve over the forehead. Next, close up the seam on a part B and then attach it to the part A unit. Again, the registration marks are important, and I found it easier to start at the top center and work my way down the side seam. And the same process can be done to the second part B, and then the center seam between the two pieces can be closed. So the helmet is looking a little wide, which is to be expected at this point, and to fix that, I'm using the heat gun on low and warming the inside of the helmet. Then I bend the foam to shape it. The foam will spring back a little, so you have to overcompensate by bending more than you'd think you would, and I'm just going to hold it in place until it cools, and then I can let go and the foam will hold its shape then. Next, the two part C's are attached to each other on their center line, and then the seam on this aligns with the center seam on the rear of the helmet, and the bottom edge of the C is even with the bottom edge of the base helmet. Up next, you've guessed it, is part D. The pieces are attached in the center, and this center aligns with the part C center line. Now, part D attaches to the bottom edge of part C, meaning part C is sitting on the top surface of part D. The end point of each side of part D needs shaped, so I heat them with the heat gun and give them a slight twist. And again, I have to hold them until the foam cools back down, and then I can let go. Okay, at this point I'm going to use a sanding drum on my Dremel and clean up some of the edges and seams. It really helps evening out the eye openings, and I also use the end to give a slight bevel around all the outer edges. This will make the pieces look thinner and help add to the illusion of it being metal. A part E can be glued onto each side. The piece sits really close to the seam between A and B and overhangs the bottom edge of the helmet base. You may find that you need to use the heat gun to get the foam to hold the correct shape. If so, it's just like the same process we did before. Part F makes the crest. You can cut it as one solid piece. That will help you in the cleanup process later on, but I needed to make it out of two because I didn't have a piece of 6mm foam big enough. The bottom edge gets a slight bevel and the crest can be glued onto the helmet, and it sits directly on the seam between A and B. And I found it better holds the shape if the crest is slightly attached from the top and then the helmet is pressed from the inside. This pushes the helmet to fit the curve of the crest and the results are more even. While I finish attaching the crest, I would really appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button if you haven't already. It's completely free to you and will help my channel grow. Plus, if you click the notification bell, you can customize your notifications so you never miss a project. Thank you. A part G can be glued on the rear center seam of the crest and helmet, and the other two about 3.5 inches down the curve on either side. And since this is a tight area, instead of using contact cement, I glue them in place with CA glue. At this point, since I had the CA glue out, I went ahead and attached the rivets onto the helmet. 7 get glued onto the front of the dome in a slight curve like so, 2 onto each part E, 3 on the front of the crest to align with each part G, and then 2 on each part G on the back, and the rest on part C. Each part E needs a hole on the bottom edge, and I'm going to burn it out by using this tip on my wood burner and simply press it into the foam. The fumes are toxic, so wear a mask and work in a well-ventilated room, but it makes a nice, fast, even hole. Now, this seam between C and D needs to look like they are one piece of bent metal, and to fill the area I'm using foam clay. I roll it into a tube and blend it into the EVA foam by dipping my fingers in water and pressing and blending with the water. The water really allows you to blend out the edges of the clay so you're left with a clean transition, and it also helps the clay really stick to the foam. Next, I'm using this smoothing stone that has a divot in the end on my Dremel to round over each rivet so they're not quite as tubular looking, but more dome shape. By simply pressing the rivet into the divot, it creates the perfect shape. The helmet will get a texture, but I want to make sure that the seams don't show through, so I'm using some of this quick seal caulk to fill them in. I'm using a plastic palette knife to smear it onto the seam, and then dip my finger in water to blend the caulk smooth. Once it's dry, I lightly sand it with some 400 grit sandpaper. This just smooths away any unevenness or left behind fingerprints. And I'm using a high grit because if I use a lower grit, the roughness will probably tear up the quick seal. So having a higher grit, finer grit, it allows you to get it a lot more smooth without damaging it. Now, for this next step, I'm using this cheap silicone caulk. You could use the quick seal, but it's more expensive, and that's why I'm going to just stick to the cheap stuff for this step. To make the metal texture, I smear an area with a thick layer of the caulk and then press the palette knife into the surface and lift it vertically so it creates these points. I do this randomly over the entire area, and once I'm happy that no knife marks are showing and everything looks random and natural, I lightly pull the knife over the surface to flatten out the points, but not too much as to smooth out the texture. The knife is about 1/8 an inch above the base caulk layer and is just floating to catch those high spots. The caulk I was using turns clear when dry, and at this point the surface can be primed with Plasti Dip, which will remain flexible and move with the foam and work as an excellent base layer for acrylic paints. For this project, I'm going to spray the helmet with 2 heavy coats. Not so heavy that they run, but thick enough so they cover all that texture. And I let the first layer sit for an hour before applying the second, and then I let the entire helmet cure overnight to make sure everything can cure properly. Then I base paint the helmet with a charcoal gray. If some of the black shows through, that's fine, but I'm working the paint into the texture as much as possible. Once that layer is dry, I then dip my brush into some metallic tin and then dab the brush onto the paper towel. Then using the paper towel, I dab the surface. I'm not looking for complete coverage, just mainly trying to catch the high points of the texture. When the tin has dried, the entire helmet gets a black wash layer. Since this step is so liquidy, it's best to work in manageable sections. Dab the wash with a clean paper towel. This will dull down the brightness of the tin as it collects in the textured grooves. And you can see how it is making the color look more like steel and not bright clean metal. Once the black wash has dried, I repeat the process with a burnt umber wash, but this time when I dab, I allow the wash to really sit in the grooves and seams. We're adding grime at this point, so think where would grime, dirt, and dust collect, and keeping the dabbing random breaks up the surface and adds more dimension. After the umber wash is dried, you can see how subtle it is, so I'm repeating with a burnt sienna wash. But now I'm applying the wash more randomly in areas where I want rust, and then dab again with the paper towel. Acrylics always dry darker than how they appear when they're wet, so this brightness of the sienna will tone down as it dries. In areas where I want the rust to really be prominent, I use straight, unthinned burnt sienna. Again, I'm thinking where would water collect and cause rusting? I brush on the paint, but to avoid brush marks, paint edges, and to blend it, I use my finger to dab and wipe to break it up and make it look more natural by making it look more random. The captain's helmet has a white sunburst on the dome and crest, so using the reference image, I sketch in the design after the sienna rust has dried. Then using a mix of white and a tiny bit of burnt umber, I dab this onto the design. I want coverage to be random and let some of the underpaint show through, and yes, some of my rust detail will be covered, but I've found in the past that it's easier to age the entire piece at once instead of trying to work around a painted design. Then the forehead gets a big red, for lack of a better term, let's call it blob in the center. I started with a darker red, in my case a crimson, and while it's still wet, add in a medium red, like fire engine red. I'm applying it sporadically and dab to blend the two reds together. Then I add a few spots of a lighter red, like a primary red. I don't want to go too far, which is why I'm only adding a few small spots and blend just a little. And after that dries, the helmet is finished. The helmet is actually really easy to assemble. It consists only of 8 pattern pieces, and when painting it, I wanted to show how just by using some basic colors and washes, it is easy to get an aged steel metal looking surface. And using the caulk helps hide the seams, and since it remains flexible after it dries, makes it ideal to create some cast metal finishes. And if you want to make this helmet to add to your own collection, I've posted a link to the pattern in the description. I hope you enjoyed this build. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, and while you're at it, check out my other Uruk-Hai themed builds. Again, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with all your friends and family, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll catch you on the next one. Have a great day. And remember, if you are building any of my builds or using any of my templates, feel free and tag me at Haas of Props on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, because I would really like to see your fantastic work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.